George Barros is head of Russia team at the U.S. Institute for Study of War. Welcome to our program, George.
Thank you very much for having me, Daniel. Good afternoon.
Ukraine has destroyed 1/3 of Russia's strategic aviation. At least 13 Russian bombers were destroyed as a result of Ukraine attack deep inside Russia on strategic aviation airfields. What is your assessment of the main implications of this attack on Russia and around the globe?
Absolutely. The key analytical question that I'm asking myself and that the Institute is asking ourselves is, was the tactic that the Ukrainians used for the Spiderweb operation a one-time spectacular occurrence, or is this going to be a new routine tactic that they can use to strike not just those 4 or 5 airfields in Russia, but all military objects across Russia? For a long time, the Russian command had a strategy, which is they've been relying on their strategic depth, the fact that they can exploit the tyranny of distance, where they maintain certain logistically and operationally significant objects far away from where the Ukrainian range of weapons are. But if the Ukrainians now have the ability to bring these FPV strike drones to any location in Russia and strike any object, then that would be a significant tactical advantage and I would argue a strategic advantage that the Ukrainians could have. So if Spiderweb tactics are just a one-time off event, then the effect is going to be marginal degradation of Russia's ability to launch air-launched cruise missiles. If it's a new tactic and the Ukrainians can hold hostage all Russian air bases and any other military object, regardless of location, then that would be a significant capabilities boost. In terms of the effect on the strikes and Russia's ability to conduct strikes, I see this as a marginal degradation of Russian capability. When the Russians conduct strikes, they of course conduct complex strike packages that include drones, like Iranian Shahed drones, that include ballistic missiles launched from the ground, like Iskanders and the KN-23 North Korean missiles. And then they include also the air-launched cruise missiles, like Kalibr missiles. The majority of the strike vehicles that the Russians have been using in their recent strike packages have been Shahed drones. And so even if you remove the air-launched cruise missiles, that does not significantly degrade the Russian ability to continue launching drones or ballistic missiles. But that said, it's important. A second effect that's also, I think, underlooked is the new budgetary constraints that this will impose on the Russian defense and procurement process for the next year. The Russians, of course, are in the business of reconstituting their forces. And currently, we have the Russian ground forces, the army, competing with the Russian airborne forces, the VDV, and I think also elements of the Russian Navy to restore elements of the damaged Russian Black Sea Fleet. Now we're going to have the Russian Air Force, the VKS, come in, and they're going to argue in front of the Kremlin that they need to restore and replace these strategic bombers because they're important for Russia's nuclear deterrence. And so now we, I think, are going to be getting into a budgetary fight between or among the Air Force, or the Airborne, the Air Force, the Navy, and the ground forces for who can take the Russian rubles from the budget to reconstitute their forces. And that, I think, is fundamentally a good problem to impose on Moscow.
Do you feel that if Ukraine continues to conduct such attacks on Russia's capabilities inside Russia, would can this at least change Russia's war efforts or change Putin's calculus on this war? And could this force Putin to make any kind of compromise during negotiations in the nearest future?
In my professional assessment, most likely no. I don't think that we can change Putin's theory of victory. As the Institute for the Study of War, we published an assessment of Putin's theory of victory. His theory of victory, in our view, is that Putin can outlast Ukraine despite strikes into the Russian rear, and that as long as Putin can outlast the political will of the international coalition supporting Ukraine, which I would argue is the center of gravity for this war, then Putin thinks he can win. And so the Ukrainians can get some good punches in. They can certainly strike strategic objects in the rear. They can increase the economic costs. They can hit ammunition factories and depots and fuel depots. But that's not going to fundamentally change Putin's theory of victory. It hurts, and there's a military utility for hitting these things. But I would actually argue that if we're going to be thinking about how to change the theory of victory, then it has to resolve with reversing Russian tactical gains on the battlefield. And I would argue that Ukraine's planners for how could they conduct these strikes, they should think about how to conduct the strikes and use long-range strike campaigns in such a way to ultimately not just hit targets of opportunity in the rear, but try to get that to support a operation that can result with some territorial reverses, some Russian territorial setbacks, and liberated Ukrainian territory, because that is important for changing Putin's calculus, more so than imposing costs deep in Russia.
Also, Ukraine has struck the Kurd Bridge for the third time using TNT, underwater explosives. What is your assessment of this another attack, and how could this bridge, what is the main role of this bridge in this war, and could even, if this bridge is destroyed, could this change the situation on the ground?
So the Kurd Strait Bridge is a very operationally significant object because the Russians use it to connect all the parts of the southern military district and bring resources and ammunition and military equipment into the southern part of the theater, into Crimea, into Kherson, into Zaporizhia. This is exactly what happened in 2022. It continues to be a major artery, even there's a heavy railroad line that goes there. And so for those reasons, it's very, very important. I would argue that in order to achieve bare minimum required Ukrainian territorial gains that can result in any sort of negotiated peace that is worth Ukraine signing and Ukraine's interest, and that is in the U.S. interest, it must include the liberation of significant strategic territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia. And so when you look at the the operational requirements to liberate significant territory in Zaporizhia and Kherson, you want to degrade Russia's logistic lines, their ground lines of communication, and you would want to cut and sever this Kerch Strait Bridge. So for those reasons, yes, you would want to hollow it out. Just as the Ukrainians degraded the Russian ability to use the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson, you want to do the same thing in Kerch. Now, the Kerch Strait Bridge is a massive superstructure. It's very difficult to destroy. You can perhaps undermine it with a variety of different attacks. I hope the Ukrainians keep attacking it. I hope they keep getting the ordnance that they need that could potentially take it out. I'm not a military engineer, so this is not my specialization, but as I've spoken to some folks who understand the construction and engineering of bridges better than I do. And as I understand, it's very difficult to destroy such a bridge unless you can fly fixed-wing aircraft and drop very heavy bombs on top of it. But perhaps underwater demolition might be another way to try to compromise the bridge, and I would support all efforts to try to destroy the bridge. But I don't know exactly how effective different attacks might be.
Also, according to Putin's thinking, according to Bloomberg, Putin confident that his army will break through Ukrainian defense lines and capture the whole 4 regions of Ukraine until the end of this year. What is your assessment of this Putin's objective for this year? So
I don't know what Putin's objectives are concretely for this year. It's my professional opinion that the Kremlin is extremely unlikely to seize all those 4 oblasts within that time frame, because if you look at the historical rate of Russian advance throughout the theater, it would actually require the Russians many, many years to seize all of Donetsk Oblast. They still have to fight their way through some of the most difficult, significant fortress cities in Donetsk Oblast, like Drushkivka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinivka, etc. And I would expect the campaigns, not just battles, but the campaigns for the seizures of those cities, that will take many, many years. I would be astonished. I mean, it would require a major departure from the Russian baseline known performance. So either the Russians have to miraculously discover how to restore maneuver to the battlefield and overcome Ukraine's drone defenses overnight, or it would either require a dramatic collapse in the Ukrainian lines that the Russians can exploit. And I assess both of these events are very unlikely. So I think what we'll likely see is a continuation of small tactical Russian gains across fields and villages at extreme costs in terms of Russian casualties. And the Russians very might not even achieve their objectives. In my assessment, the Russian immediate objective for the summer 2025 campaign is to seize Konstantinivka. And they're setting the conditions for a pitched battle against Konstantinivka. And they very well might seize it if we were to talk again this time in 9 months. But they might not. I mean, last year in 2024, all the analysts, American analysts, British analysts, Ukrainian analysts, we were talking about the Russian campaign for Pokrovsk. And some analysts said that Russia would get Pokrovsk. Some analysts were saying they would not get Pokrovsk. It turned out that despite over 9 months of campaigning in the Avdiivka, Pokrovsk direction, the Russians actually indeed culminated around Pokrovsk. They never seized the settlement. They came to the outskirts, but then the Russians largely changed their operational objectives, and they have now redeployed units that were previously fighting for Pokrovsk to go to Konstantinivka. So now they think the Russians will be able to advance there. So we shall see. But in terms of seizing all of Donetsk Oblast within a short amount of time, that will, I would be very surprised. I would be shocked.
Also, if Putin continues this war for another years, what would this cost for Russia, and how many dilemmas he will face during his war? Because Russians are moving to 1 million losses, killed and wounded, and also Russia has some problems with their economy. For how long they can continue this war, and how many dilemmas they will face on their way in Ukraine?
So there's a couple of variables we have to talk about here. You have to assume that the Russian casualty rate resumes the same. If the Ukrainians do not impose the same levels of casualties, that being about 35 to 45,000 killed and wounded per month, then the Russians will be able to sustain the war longer. But let's assume for this very basic analysis that the Ukrainians maintain the same lethality, that you Russians continue to lose forces at the same rate, roughly 30 to 45,000 troops per month. And then I think the Russians will get to a point where they will have to start making some very difficult decisions within the next 12 to 18 months. I'm not going to say concretely when, and I'm not going to say this is the point at which they break, but there'll be difficult decisions. As you know, the Russian strategy for how to finance this war is not sustainable. The Russians pay extreme amounts of money to volunteers to sign up to a fight in Ukraine. I believe the current running record that we have is between $30,000 and $40,000 for a one-time sign up. That does not include your monthly salary, does not include benefits if you're killed or wounded or other things. And when the Russians lose between 35 to 45,000 killed and wounded per month, I mean, that's a lot of money when you add it up. And this is actively destroying the liquidity in Russia's sovereign wealth fund. The Russian economy is overheating. Too many Russians have too much money and they're spending too much, which is causing inflation. It's very interesting. The Russian central bank just lowered the interest rate, not because I think inflation is no longer an issue, but I think because the Russian government is making some monetarily risky decisions in order to facilitate borrowing and lending so that the Russians can continue keeping the war factories running and keeping the banking class and the business interests happy in Russia. But really, when you look at it, and you can continue to look at the costs and the inflation and the monetary instability and the ballooning Russian budget, this looks to be quite unsustainable. I mean, Russia, when you look at history, whenever they've had to fight a large-scale war that resulted with many casualties, Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers, they would die like slaves. They would be forced to go fight, not compensated for anything. I mean, they were either serf conscripts from the Tsarist imperial model, or they were Soviet conscripts in the Soviet model. But this is not the model that Putin is using. Putin has a new social contract where he pays you. And I think Putin's strategy, it's politically brilliant because it absolves the Russian state if you're killed or wounded because you took the money. But it's economically stupid. And it can work for a short special military operation, a short war. It does not work for a long protracted war that will go on for 3 to 5 years.
So you're confident that Russia can continue this war with such current intensity for 12, 18 months, and after this period they would have to conduct full-scale mobilization or reach a ceasefire deal?
I think they have to make difficult decisions at 12 to 18 months. So those could be decisions such as, yes, potentially going to a full wartime economy. It could include nationalization of more privately held assets to try to crank out more materiel to support the war effort. It could result with the Kremlin changing its social contract with soldiers. So it could be perhaps not mobilization, but perhaps the incentives will have to be cut severely. So instead of offering, $40,000, it'll be, we go back to offering just a couple 100,000 rubles or a couple thousand rubles, which would drastically change. And I think you would see much fewer Russian forces come through that time. The Russians might have to change their objectives in Ukraine and scope it down. Or they might, they're going to have to make calls between, do they prioritize the military economy or the domestic civilian economy? And they might revert back to an economic model which looks much more like the Soviet economic model, which is an economy built up for industry and the war industry at the expense of consumer goods. It doesn't mean that the war breaks. It doesn't mean that the war ends. It doesn't mean that the Kremlin now has to declare full-scale war. But Putin will have to make very difficult decisions that I think he doesn't want to. I mean, Putin is happy basically with the political and economic compromises he's made, the trade-offs he's made. But he might be forced out of that. And of course, Russians do not like it when their social agreements, their social contract is violated.
Do you feel that in such cases there could be a threat to Russian regime because there would be a high discontent inside Russia, and some people could demonstrate against it, or even people from Putin's circle?
I think that's very unlikely. The power vertical is very strong. Putin has made examples throughout his career of those politicians or oligarchs or Siloviki that go against him. The most recent example being Yevgeny Prigozhin, but there's also, of course, Boris Nemtsov, and going back a bit further, Hodorkovsky with Yukos. So the oligarchs know what waits them if they try to challenge the power vertical. So I don't think that's particularly likely. But that said, it's important because Putin does care about what the oligarchs have to say. He does care what the Siloviki has to say. He is thinking about the regime stability. And if these guys do have issues with the Kremlin, then that causes problems. So I think the risk of a revolt or a coup or revolution very low, but these tensions and these pressures are still nonetheless important, and they deeply influence the way that Putin governs and the decision making that Putin makes.
You just also mentioned about the Yevgeny Prigozhin's marriage on Moscow. What are the chances for another coup inside Russia, so-called Prigozhin-style marriage on Moscow from different fractions in the Russian army or from mercenaries?
I think it's very, very low. So you should really talk to my colleague, Katerina Stepanenko, who's been doing some excellent research on this topic. But the Russian Ministry of Defense has been conducting a centralization campaign that is designed to very firmly establish the power vertical over all the Russian various different formations and units, including irregular units, proxy units, volunteer battalions, etc. And of course, the whole reason why the Wagner-Prigozhin mutiny came to a head is because the Ministry of Defense went to Wagner and said, all Wagner soldiers now have to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense and fall under the administrative control of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And many Russian Wagner soldiers refused to do that because they saw their loyalties primarily to the Wagner group as an institution and not to being, Gerasimovsy or Shoigusy, right? And that's what caused the conflict. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense has now, in the aftermath of the rebellion, decisively won this conflict. All Russian combatants are basically now forced to sign documents and submit themselves to being under the operational control of the Ministry of Defense. The Africa Corps, the Wagner split-off group that went to Africa, that has been subsumed and is now part of the command and control and the administrative control of the Russian General Staff and the Ministry of Defense. I mean, this is basically over, with the exception of perhaps a general who is currently loyal to the regime going rogue, which I would argue is a very unlikely occurrence. They've got this under control. I mean, Putin identified the risks that Wagner Group posed, that Prigozhin posed, and they started to correct the ship. And the situation's much more secure, much more stable now, I would argue.
And do you also see this reason of this Pregosian coup, because Wagner Group was an independent group, independent from Russia's Ministry of Defense, and do you see this as a reason why Russia's Ministry of Defense decided to take control of Wagner Group, because they were afraid of possibility of coup or another actions from Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Yes, that's exactly right. So, Yevgeny Prigozhin became extremely powerful and influential. His organization was in 2023, the Wagner Group was the most effective fighting force in the Russian armed forces. I mean, they did the Battle of Bakhmut. They had a very high, unlike the traditional Russian Ministry of Defense forces, the Wagner Group had very high morale. They had better and more effective leadership than the rest of the Russian Ministry of Defense. The corruption was lower. The loyalty to the troops was higher. It was a better run military organization. And that's because of the unique charter and the institution and the command culture that Yevgeny Prigozhin and the former and Dmitry Utkin, call sign Wagner, that they established within that organization. And it was very attractive and it was very effective. And the men that went to go sign up to fight with Wagner, they saw themselves as Wagner guys. They did not see themselves as Shoigu guys or Gerasimov guys. They were separate. It was sexy. And Yevgeny Prigozhin became increasingly important for the Kremlin because he was the guy you called to get results. When you need to break through in the Battle of Bakhmut and get results, you go to Prigozhin, and Prigozhin would deliver. He was brutal, but he delivered. Prigozhin became full of himself. His ambitions, he choked on his ambitions. He thought that he could do more. He challenged openly the regime. He called into question Shoigu and Gerasimov, their competency, their corruption, and in doing so indirectly challenged Putin's authority and regime, because Putin ultimately, of course, has instated Shoigu and Gerasimov. And when the Kremlin was then trying to say, okay, let's reassert who is in control here. It is the Ministry of Defense. All Wagner soldiers must now sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. They refused. They said they're not going to do that, and that's what ultimately led to the march of so-called March of Justice, the March Sprawiedliwości, and that's what caused that whole drama.
Thank you, George, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Yeah, Ram Slava. Thank you, Daniel. Very nice speaking with you as always.